Okay, hi, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on whereabouts in the world you are. Welcome to the to this session of the Sunoikisis Digital Classics, the autumn 2021 semester, autumn in Europe, let's say, at any rate, in the Northern Hemisphere. This session will be on translation and text alignment, which sort of fits in both with the thread on annotation that we've had, but also on the thread on linguistic approaches and computational approaches to language. So it's quite a good crossing over of those themes in this semester's program. We have three presenters this week. We have Chiara Palladino from Furman University, Farnoosh Shamsian from Leipzig University, and Maia Shukhosvili from Tbilisi State University in Georgia. And they will all be presenting, talking to us, and we'll have some discussion at the end. Those of you who are watching us live on YouTube, welcome. Please feel free to use the live chat feature, as I see some of you are already, just to say hi, but also to make comments, ask questions, and join the discussion that we'll have at the end. I think that's probably all I need to say by way of introduction, so I'll hand over to Chiara, who will give you a bit more of an overview of the session. And please, all three of the speakers, please introduce yourselves in a little bit more detail than I did as well.
Hello, everybody. Thanks, Gabby. Hi, everyone. My name is Chiara Palladino. I am here from my office at Furman University, where I am assistant professor of classics. And I've been working on translation alignment for quite some time. And in this particular session, I will be introducing one particular tool for text annotation and translation alignment that I've been working with my colleagues at Leipzig University, Farnoosh representing for them, and with my colleague Tarek Youssef at Leipzig University. So in this session, we're going to do a couple of things. I'm going to introduce the principles of translation alignment and why that is a particularly interesting topic, both in the domain of humanities and computer science studies. Then I'm going to give you a very short introduction about what Ugarit is and how it works. And we are going to examine, together with Farnoosh, some case studies of how we use translation alignment in research, in teaching, and in a variety of other sort of more cross-linguistic and big data approaches. And then afterwards, I will turn it over to Maia for a short demo and a short introduction of how Ugarit works, so that everybody can replicate what we do and replicate the experiment. And then we're going to have a short conversation about what we use translation alignment for, and hopefully have some participants share their experience with Ugarit and translation alignment as well. So I'm going to start off with the basic principles of text alignment and transition into translation alignment more specifically. So first of all, what is text alignment in general? Text alignment is a very essential task in natural language processing, and partly a very problematic one as well. You can perform text alignment in a manual kind of setting, of course, but also automatically or semi-automatically in sort of controlled environments. And basically what text alignment consists of is the comparison of two or more texts with the attempt of defining similarities and divergencies at different levels. You can do text alignment at the level of document, at the level of paragraph, or even at the very fine-grained level of words and tokens. You can also compare text in different languages or in the same language. And these operations are defined as cross-language or translation alignment and intra-language alignment, respectively. You can also align potentially an unlimited number of texts. So obviously, in principle, you could align an unlimited number of texts in both operations, although from a user perspective, it would be better to limit the number of texts that are involved in the alignment, just to avoid, creating alignment monsters. And the reason why we define alignment in terms of numbers of texts as well is because the tools and the algorithms used for both operations are different. And so the method and the models applied differ depending on whether you're aligning text in a different language, in the same language, on whether you're aligning two texts or multiple texts. So let's talk a little bit more about translation alignment and what that is. Translation alignment is the operation of aligning at different levels texts that are encoded in different languages, and they can be two texts, pairwise alignment, or multiple texts. And basically, translation alignment is an operation that is performed on what we call generally parallel texts or parallel corpora, depending on the dimension. And the parallel texts are generally considered to be collections of texts where one original is placed alongside a translation or translations in different languages. And these are called generally parallel corpora. The alignment of parallel texts is generally called cross-linguistic alignment or translation alignment. And so, as you probably know, there are several parallel corpora that are also freely available on the internet, and some of them are very famous. For example, the Bible corpus has a lot of different translations. Film subtitles are notoriously a kind of parallel corpus, and you can obviously switch from different languages, starting from the original language of the show or the text, and you can have a variety of different translations of each occurrence. Now, translation alignment, text alignment in general is a very complex natural language processing problem, but translation alignment is probably the top of the food chain in those terms because, as you can probably imagine, it has to deal with a lot of issues that transcend simple computational analysis. Think about the challenge of translating a text in a different language. A lot of those same challenges are replicated in translation alignment in computational environments. And then there are more, of course, that deal with, the necessity of establishing structural analytical correspondences between languages that may be extremely different from each other. So one of the standard problems that we encounter when we try to do translation alignment in computational environments is the problem of crossing dependencies. Generally, languages have different word orders, for example, and different orders of sentences, and translations even do not necessarily account for syntactical order, and in general, they do not necessarily respect the word order of the original as an independent choice of the translator. So that obviously complicates things when it comes to defining models and especially automatic models for translation alignment. In addition to that, there will not always be perfect lexical correspondence, as you can imagine, because the task of a translator is not necessarily to just, give you binary lexical correspondence between the original and the target language. It is also to make it understandable. And the more different, the more distance two texts and two cultures are, the more complicated that operation is. And so there is not always perfect word by word or even sentence by sentence correspondence when we try to attempt an alignment in automatic settings. The context can also condition the result in translation alignment, and we will see a couple of examples of how that happens and why that happens. And then finally, there are things that are even more complex than all of that, which mirror the problems of translators to a lot of extent. So, for example, how to render and how to analytically align wordplays, allusions, stylistic peculiarities, such as peculiarities of poetry, and so on and so forth. All of these are extremely problematic, as you can imagine, in both professional translation and translation alignment. And probably for that reason, translation alignment has a lot of applications. And that is why it has been a very popular problem in computer science since the 90s, at the very least. So because of this, we designed a tool, Ugarit, which is a tool for text alignment. It's a web-based tool for annotating text and establishing correspondences between them. And Ugarit was created between 2016 and 2017 to respond to a very specific need to kind of a specific niche, so to speak. Ugarit is a web-based tool. First of all, you can find it online. And the aim was to provide a tool for performing manual and semi-automatic alignment of parallel texts, with a particular attention to historical and under-resourced languages. We designed Ugarit originally with the basic idea that for the improvement of automatic translation alignment methods, we do not have a lot of training data and a lot of manually aligned pairs for under-resourced languages. So for example, we have a lot of training data for English, for example, for a lot of modern languages as well, French, German, Chinese, and so on. But we really don't have as much training data for historical languages, for example, Latin, Classical Arabic, Egyptian, Persian, Ancient Greek, and so on. And we also don't have that for a lot of underrepresented languages, like First Nation languages, for example. So the first idea was to put us in the position to do that and to collect a training data set for under-resourced languages through what was essentially a crowdsourcing project. So we wanted to create a tool that everybody could use in different ways. And we realized, however, that users had started to use Ugarit for so much more than just that, so much more just than creating training data sets. And so since 2016, our number of users and the number of languages and texts that we got in Ugarit has steadily increased. We currently have more than 500 users and about 500,000 translation pairs in 45 different languages. So evidently there is something there, and there is a need that Ugarit is responding to. Ugarit is also very easy to use. Maia will definitely talk more about that at the end of the session, but basically Ugarit works in terms of just simply uploading your text in a textual format, and then there is a very simple editing view for establishing correspondences between words or groups of words manually. And you can do that on a bilingual corpus or on a trilingual corpus. So you can align 2 languages or 3 languages or 3 texts, depending on what you're working on. And once you're done with that, you can see your own translation alignment in the main page under new alignments. You also have a user profile where you can edit and perfect your translation alignments. And we also offer a couple of new things to facilitate specific applications of translation alignment, particularly in learning environments. That's what we were thinking about. We provide a transliteration service and a tokenization service for certain languages and for non-Latin alphabets particularly. So as you hover with your mouse on a token that is in a non-Latin language, you will be able to see the transliteration of that language. So since we started, evidently, people started using Ugarit for a variety of things, as I mentioned. And in principle, there's already a number of standard applications for the type of work that we do and the type of data sets that we collect, primarily in computer science, as I mentioned. Manually aligned pairs are used to train models for automatic translation alignment. And there are very established methods to do that. The most used are definitely statistical models, but there are also new models, for example, neural models, which are based on more automatic establishment of correspondences and do not need as many training data as statistical models. However, when we started working with Ugarit, we realized that there were so many other applications and so many other things that users were using Ugarit for. So for instance, there are a lot of integrations with reading environments that are possible. If you have, a gold standard aligned parallel corpus, you can integrate it with your reading environment. Translation alignment has also been used as a learning tool. There are independent researchers and research projects that use alignment as an integration, or even just to answer a particular research question. One of the primary uses for the training data sets is also to establish dynamic lexica And there's a variety of other things that you can do. We've been doing a little bit of research on user behavior and reading comprehension. And there is a lot of work that can be done to critically evaluate translations of different languages and to establish cross-linguistic correspondences by means of the translation pairs that we have. So now I'm going to leave the stage to my colleague, Farnoosh, who is going to illustrate some of the most exciting applications of Ugarit in the field of scholarly translation alignment.
Thank you, Chiara. My name is Farnoosh Shamsian, and I'm an Iranian PhD student at the University of Leipzig. I work on teaching teaching ancient Greek through digital annotations, specifically to Persian speakers, also to English speakers as well. So I will be talking about some research, some uses of alignment in research, and specifically in this case on a specific term that we see in a multilingual source that we have from Parthian, Middle Persian, and Ancient Greek. So translation alignment for research purposes can be used, especially if we have a complex text, and it can help us to get some information out of the text that normally is much more difficult to gather manually. That is, in this case, I will be talking about a term that rather has an unclear meaning in an inscription at Cabezartos. So a little bit of background about this inscription. The most important inscription, and in general the first-hand source that we have from the Sasanian Empire, is an inscription at Cabezartos, as you see in the picture, done by Shapur I. And the content of the inscription is mostly just first introduction of Shapur and his ancestors. Then he will mention the names of different provinces of his empire, and tells about his campaigns against the Roman Empire. And at the end, lists his donations to the gods and all the fire temples that he has built, and eventually advises his successors to do the same. So this inscription has three versions: a Middle Persian version, which maybe we can assume that this is the original, and the other two are the translations of that, because Middle Persian is the official language of the Sasanian Empire. So the Middle Persian is on the eastern wall, the Parthian is on the western wall, and the Greek is on the southern wall of Cabezartos. So one issue of actually digitally presenting these inscription is the issue of writing system and script, because certain writing systems are rather more difficult to actually represent digitally, and for that reason, especially because of the whole print culture, we have a certain way of representing these writing systems without actually using the same thing. That would be the transliteration. And that is what I have been using in Ugarit. So here we have a trilingual alignment. The first one is the Greek version of this inscription. The second one is a transliteration, and the third one is a transcription. So the transliteration is mostly representing the graphemes of the writing system. So each letter, in a way, has been replaced by another letter just to be able to, print it or present it online. Easier sense, but the transcription is representing the phonemes. So this might not be much of an issue, for example, if you're thinking about, for example, ancient Greek, because how you write is much more closer to how you pronounce the words compared to most writing systems of Persian, Iranian languages, because they usually don't show the short vowels. So, but for the purpose of this presentation, I haven't used the transliteration, but actually kind of used the trilingual alignment to show an English translation. So here we have the Greek version, the Parthian version, and an English translation that I got from the source for the English translation is the Parthian resources. It's a website specifically for gathering resources on Parthian language. And the translator is Jake Nabel. So the word, the certain term I want to see throughout this inscription is a Parthian word, dastgert, that you see in the alignment. And you see it in the English as their word. And that's how I have aligned it. But if you look at the Greek and see, it has not really been translated, but actually is transcribed. So I assume that that word is simply dusty Caritas. So just a transcription of the Parthian word. And the meaning of this word is rather a bit unclear throughout this inscription. We see this word a few times in the inscription. Another time here, you see even the English translation doesn't translate it, and it's just written as dastgert in the English translation. Same in the Greek. And one more time, the same issue is there. And in another paragraph, so as you see, I have aligned in 3 different paragraphs of this inscription. You actually see a translation for this word in the Greek that would be ktisma. I actually should mention that the English translation is a translation of the Parthian version, and so the Greek version is not really involved in that sense, and therefore, of course, when it's translated as word or when translated as dastgert might be a different issue. So if I actually use this word search function in Ugarit, what I get is this diagram that you see on the right that shows us how this Parthian word has been translated to Greek and to English. So both of these languages has either transcribed or translated this word. We have 2 translations, one as ktisma and one again as word. The rest is just transcription. So, this might be actually interesting how the inflection of this word in Greek has worked out. So you have the stikertas and the stikirt, and then the stikirten, different depending on how it has been used in text. If you actually look up this word ktisma, the translation we have in the Greek for this word dastgert in the Perseus vocabulary tool, we see in general the meaning of building or temple or just a colony or foundation. These are all the translations that we see in LSJ. And the meanings of dastgert, the Parthian and the Middle Persian, in Parthian and Middle Persian lexicons also is mostly mansion or estate or land or property. But if you actually go back to the text that we see, for example, here, if you look at the English translation, it's saying that so that the gods will be an aid to him. He's talking about his successor and is advising his successor to follow the same and actually, yeah. And so that the god will be an aid to him and will make him their dastgert. But if we think that dastgert here means property or foundation, it may not make that much of sense. But another example here, since the god made me their ward, in the Parthian we have dastgert, and I actually like this translation of ward because of how it would work well with different meanings of dastgert. And let's go back to so etymologically we have a word in an old Persian inscription, Dastakurtak, that means that is etymologically probably the root for this Parthian word, and meaning done by hand or handmade or hand constructed. So probably there is another Middle Persian phrase, common phrase, to pad dast kardan, to achieve and or to get to, or to reach. So these are what we have that might be similar in meaning to dastgert, and probably based on what we see in the inscription. And by the comparison, it would be more probable that the meaning in that certain sentence, so that the gods would make me their ward, would be so the gods. He's actually showing that he's akin to gods, or he's created by gods in a sense. It's very common in Middle Persian literature for someone to say that they are related and they are created by Ahura Mazda, so the gods, and not by Ahriman, so by the devil, and in a way that is a way to state your righteousness. And I assume that is what Shapur is doing. He's saying that I'm related to the gods and not to the evil forces. Same here, that the god will help his successor and will he will be a creation of the gods and not the evil. In a sense, what we have here, that alignment actually helps us gather all this information in one place and be able to track each of these terms and each of these words throughout a text. Another use for alignment would be to actually not look for certain words or for certain terms, but just to evaluate translation. An example that I have here is an indirect translation of Iliad in comparison to the direct translation. So we have 3 translations of Iliad in Persian. One is actually just from book 1. So the first one is by Said Nafisi from the French. The second one by Mir Jalaluddin Kazvasi, again from the French. And interestingly, they have used the same text, probably the most accessible one at the time. And the last one, which I did last year, is directly from the Greek text. So here I like to talk about what possibilities we have when using Ugarit to show the differences between different translations of one text. The first thing, and the most probably obvious one, is that you can easily in the alignment you see in the slide see that the unaligned words are in a different color, and that would help us to see what words actually don't have an equivalent in the, or don't match properly a word in the original text. But in addition to that, we can get some statistics from Ugarit that would help us, depending on our perspective and our approach, to evaluate the translations. Here, our first translation is, our first alignment is from the direct translation. And as you see, we have a very high one-to-one pairs. That compared to the first indirect translation by Nafisi, you see much more one-to-many and less one-to-one pairs. And the last one, also an indirect translation, is showing similar features. So just to gather all this information in one place, here you see that the 2 first translations are the indirect ones, and they have much less one-to-one pairs compared to the last one, which is the direct translation. There are much more actually to say about this chart, but I just want to point out one other feature that you see. The number of unaligned tokens is much higher in indirect translations compared to the direct ones. And I just want to look into what exactly is happening in the text that has caused this high number of unaligned tokens. And at the same time, maybe this can show us why the one-to-one number is much higher, depending on the context. So I chosen 3 words from the 2 lines of Iliad. Iliad 1 as line 3 and line 25, just to see what we have to convey the meaning of the Greek word in Persian. Of course, those 2 translations have actually got all this from the French translation, and the translators have never faced the Greek text, and probably that's what is causing the issue. So if we actually trace this back to the French translation, we might see that, for example, if Themos has been translated to 2 words and not 1. so our, as you see, each of these words have only one word as an equivalent in the direct translation, but at least two in indirect translation. And actually, for example, krateron has been translated as a phrase in one of the indirect translations. So yeah, in addition to what we see as ways to evaluate texts for research purposes, the same tool can be used for pedagogical purposes. And I've been teaching a course on Homeric Greek, and the course, of course, is ongoing. And we have been very frequently using Ugarit for different purposes. For first, I think the easiest way to actually have a reading environment in a course would be to use it in a line format. If you at the word level, if you have a very long text, because it would be much easier to follow what word are we talking about in the translation or in the original text. So the first use, of course, for me is to use it as a reading environment in the classroom. But at the same time, it would be very helpful as a vocabulary learning tool. And the reason for that is that there is a lot of incidental learning. If you are actually aligning a text, that would you wouldn't normally have that incidental learning if you're using, for example, a word list. Of course, we use the same thing for learning assessment, and there are certain texts that I have used for alignment as a class assignment during the course. And here's one example. The title is in Persian, but it says the 6th session. So this is the assignment of the 6th session. I was very surprised to see that there is almost no mistakes in this alignment. And by 6th session, that means that the students have had 9 hours of official training, starting from the alphabet. So the first session is learning the Greek alphabet. And they have been, almost everybody has been able to do the alignment between the direct translation that I have prepared for this purpose and the Greek text. And as you see, there is not much unaligned tokens left. And Ugarit won't be able to give the students feedback really on their alignment of if they have done everything correctly or not. But it can give them a statistic. So that's partly the teacher's job to actually evaluate the translations and see if the students have done well, like any other translation evaluation. But the statistics would be interesting to look at, I think, even for the students. So we have none many-to-many alignments. And I think that's actually a good sign. That means that the student was able to recognize what word means what in the text. And
Looks like we've briefly lost Farnoosh. Should we give the moment to see if she comes back, or does someone else want to take over and she can carry on?
Maybe we can go on and give her the time to see if we can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can take over with. Maybe we can continue along the lines of that. And I can introduce our study on user behavior first, so that we don't lose too much of the previous thread. And then when Farnoosh comes back, she can continue illustrating her particular use case, if that's okay.
Perfect.
Okay. All right. So sorry for the interruption. Just kind of going along the lines of what Farnoosh was saying, I think it would be a good idea also to talk about about big picture tendencies and trends, so to speak. One of the things that we started doing with Ugarit once we started having, kind of an increased participation was to investigate a little bit into the behavior of specific typologies of users, what they were aligning, what kinds of patterns we could see in the establishment of translation pairs, how certain factors would impact on those patterns, like reading comprehension, language proficiency, whether they were following guidelines or not, the purpose, why they were doing a certain alignment, the level of expertise, whether they were native speakers of one of the languages that they were aligning, and so on and so forth. And so in this particular session, I'm going to briefly talk about two use cases, one with expert users and one with students. I think it would be most productive to talk about students first. So we have a lot of students and instructors on Ugarit, and so we started extracting information about the establishment of different translation pairs and trends across different groups. And the statistics that you can see here, the chart that you can see here, is from one specific group composed by 2 master students in ancient Greek, so a decent level of proficiency in the language, and the instructor, which is the bar in orange. And we compared their different alignment strategies on the same passage in ancient Greek, a paragraph of the Histories of Herodotus, aligned against an English translation. And the idea was basically just to test how different levels of language expertise would impact on the establishment of specific translation pairs and trends in translation pairs rates. So as you can probably distinctively see from the chart, there are certain tendencies that are very clear. So for example, the most expert user in this case, the instructor, has a very distinct tendency to establish one-to-one alignments and to partly compensate what is missing with one-to-many alignments. This means basically that one word in ancient Greek is most often aligned with only one word in English. But it can also happen a fair amount of times that one word in Greek is aligned against more than one in English, so one-to-many. However, the instructor definitely has a tendency to go for what we could call a more lexical type of correspondence. So one word is just aligned with a word that has an equivalent meaning in English. And this has been confirmed by other investigations. The general tendency is that the more expert a user is, the more they will try to align one-to-one wherever it is possible. Whereas less expert users, and this varies depending on the level of expertise, will tend to work a lot more with word groups. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, obviously, because sometimes you just have to reason in terms of word groups. The problem is, one, the number of word groups that are used, how many times there is a prevalent many-to-many alignments, and more importantly, the arbitrariness in the establishment of those word groups. So for example, in the chart, you can see that one of the users in particular, the red bar, has a tendency to do one-to-one and one-to-many rather frequently, but there is definitely a pretty high number of many-to-many translation pairs as well, given the context. And we have also seen that the lower the expertise is in the language, the more the many-to-many rate increases. So we can, and the higher the discrepancy between the instructor and the student, of course. So we can definitely see that generally less expert users tend to use word groups as a way to, compensate a kind of a lack of comfort and lack of security in dealing with the language, and being a little bit less analytical in establishing correspondences, in a directly opposite tendency to what instructors and expert users do. Other tendencies that we've seen that kind of confirm that idea is that lexical error, lexical correspondence in the wrong way is obviously much higher, the lower the level of expertise. So students and non-experts who do not have a strong confidence with vocabulary, for example, will tend to align words to free or incorrect translations at a much higher level than expert users and instructors. And the alignment strategy in the establishment of word groups is going to be a lot more inconsistent. I mentioned arbitrariness early on. Essentially, this means that users will select specific word groups like article and noun, for example, or noun and adjective, or noun and pronoun, and so on, auxiliary and verb, and then align them with a many-to-many relationship. However, they won't necessarily reason in terms of the grammatical function of those word groups. In fact, we have seen that other constructs that would require the same kind of establishment of a word group are regularly overlooked by students, like participial constructs is one of the most frequent. And so grammatically meaningful groups are actually very inconsistent across the alignment and very arbitrarily established. So as a general principle, the establishment of one-to-one matches is an indicator of a higher precision, although it has to be compared with other tendencies as well, which is kind of interesting to observe, considering that it may seem counterintuitive in principle, because binary word correspondence is almost never the best strategy to translate a text, as you can imagine. But in the context of an analytical comparison, especially with very different linguistic structures, expert users tend to be pretty consistent in the establishment of distinct lexical choices. The other group that we compared was a couple of groups of expert users. And basically here we wanted to see whether expert users would be consistent in the establishment of specific translation pairs across texts. And so we picked groups of users, pairs of users who were pretty similar in background and in language expertise. And we extracted all of their translation pairs to see whether they pretty much not only had the same strategy, but whether there would be a perfect correspondence in terms of the choice of lexical alignments. And the results were pretty interesting, even though expert users tend still to privilege one-to-one translation pairs. Sometimes they tend to have very distinct strategies in the establishment of translation alignments, even if they have from a pretty similar background. So for example, here in the chart, you can see a couple of expert users which are very similar in background, native Farsi speakers. They aligned a selection of the Masnavi poems against the same English translation. And the pretty interesting factor about this is that they didn't follow guidelines. They didn't have any. So they basically worked with their own understanding of the context and the language. And as you can see, in the chart, there are pretty similar, pretty equivalent tendencies in dealing with the structural differences between the language. And so expert users, they will have a pretty high rate of one-to-one alignments, although user 2 seems to have a pretty strong tendency to compensate with one-to-many alignments. And this has essentially linguistic reasons, which we will come to in a second. But when we extracted the translation pairs and we inspected them manually, we realized that there were specific choices that those users made, which were which displayed a lot of disagreement with each other, which is very interesting because it sort of reveals that even expert users find the task difficult at different levels. So as a general number, in terms of individual translation pairs, so which words were aligned with which, about half of the translation pairs did not overlap across these two users. And some of the discrepancies were very minor. They just depended on how the linguistic structures were addressed. So, for example, one user omitted the preposition in the English translation and the other one did not. But there were some choices, some discrepancies in the translation pairs that really depended on the understanding of the context. And these are the choices that are very difficult to address, for example, with language guidelines. As you can see, there are two cases here that we isolated. There are more, but these are particularly interesting to exemplify. One of these words in Persian, hordan, which one of the two users aligned with eat and the other one with to eat or drink, is a very rich word in Persian because it means so much more than just eating. It includes meanings like to eat, to gnaw, to drink, even to suffer. And so it is a very personal choice of the user to decide whether you want to align it with a simple individual word translation or not. And so as you can see, one of the two users just opted for a more concise alignment and translation pair. The other one opted for a one-to-many. And none of them is technically incorrect. It just depends on the context and the understanding of the context by the user or of that even particular word. And we observed pretty much the same trends with a similar group of Italian speakers with a similar background who aligned Latin and Italian. And some differences were at the same time editorial choices. I see that Farnoosh is back in the program, so I think maybe I can give word back to her.
So I think Farnoosh also wasn't sure exactly when she left.
Yes, because I didn't realize that I got disconnected for a while.
So we were, you were talking about the alignment statistics for your students. That's the last thing.
Yeah, okay.
I think it was slide 43, maybe.
Okay, thank you. So, yeah, I start from here then again. I'm sorry for the interruption. So I've been using the translation alignment for class assignments. And here, this is a alignment from the 6th session of the class. As you see, there is not many unaligned tokens. And I'm actually surprised to see how the number of mistakes are very, very low, even after about 9 hours of teaching, which is great because this all contributes to the data we can use afterwards. And so what we have from the statistics of the alignment statistics that Ugarit can give us is that, as you see, the one-to-one number of translation pairs are much higher, and we have a few one-to-many and no many-to-manys. And that's actually good from the perspective of an instructor, because that shows that the student was able to recognize the equivalent of each word in the Greek text and align it to the Persian equivalent. So another assignment that we have done was to use the indirect translations and ask the students to revise that indirect translation in a way that it would be closer to the Greek. And so I think I conveyed this message that the one-to-one pairs are much more desirable in a sense, which are for many purposes. But actually, I have an example here that shows the one-to-one alignment is not always the best, and from the point of view of a teacher. So notos has been translated to dabur in Persian, meaning one word that means southwind or southwestern wind. The revision that the student has done on this is that he has decided that this, because the word dabur is not very common, and we actually in the class, when we were looking at this word, we weren't shown, and we actually looked it up in a lexicon to see what it means in Persian. So he had decided to give a bit of explanation in the alignment. As you see, that causes one-to-many alignment. And of course, I don't see that as a bad thing, or I think it actually works very well. And for the purpose of assessment, shows me that he understood the text and the context very well. Another thing that you can see here is that they have, I think it's very common for the students to use not one definite finalized version, but actually give multiple equivalents in the parentheses and then align those as well, which is not a problem from the instructor's point of view, but the result would be a one-to-many alignment. So the statistics for the trilingual alignments might not be that helpful, but here we see that we have a much higher one-to-many in the revised version. So I think the most interesting features for me in Ugarit is the possibility of searching vocabulary. And I'm always surprised when I look at the results, even when I'm the person who has done all the alignments that has that word, I'm still surprised at these results. And so here we have Pauline in the text. If you actually click on that word in Ugarit, this is what you will see, plus a diagram at the end that I have cut out. So the Persian equivalence here is all show how the accusative case has been translated to Persian. So we have one translation, shahr, meaning city, but it has been translated as shahr as an object of the verb to the city, and in a sense that this shows us certain features of Persian language compared to the Greek, a Greek word in accusative case. So another word I've found interesting is this word anax, meaning king or lord or master or sovereign. I think I think that actually what we see here describes the meaning of this word very well. So and another word laoi, and just keep in mind that these words are not lemmatized. Otherwise, we would be able to see all the instances of laoi, which is now in nominative plural. If we could see every possible alignment of laos in Persian, we would have had much more instances. But even in this sense, what we have here is very clear. And I know that if you speak most European languages have lexicons, not one, sometimes many lexicons for their language to Greek to I don't know, French, English, German. So this is probably not very exciting, but if you are a Persian speaker and working on ancient Greek, and you can see how this word has been translated throughout the corpus to Persian and have all these equivalents, which I think are actually very, very accurate for our corpus, which was Iliad. I think that's very exciting. And the last one, we have two Persian words that are rather difficult to translate the difference into English, that is khost and erade. One has the meaning of will as a demand. The other one as will as what you have as a volition, so the force that is behind it. I found that very interesting, that's itself, when I was translating into to English, was a bit difficult. And one last thing is that I've been working on this online course for teaching Greek in Persian, and this is just a demo I made, of course, for this presentation. But as you see, there is the option to embed an alignment inside a textbook or a text that you use for teaching, and the same, not just as a reading environment, but actually throughout the exercises. For example, this is an exercise asking to simply asking what's the word straton doing in this sentence, and we would have multiple choice questions that would be automatically you get the answer. So I think that would be the end of my my presentation, and thank you very much again. Sorry for the interruption.
I can say a couple more words before turning it over to Maia for the demo.
We are getting a little bit close to the end, just so.
Yeah.
Just to say, in terms of time, yeah.
I will give Maia the space for discussing. So just one very quick thing. As we mentioned, there are so many different applications for Ugarit, and I'm sure that we will receive a lot of questions about various things at this point. But one thing that I really want to emphasize, particularly because it's kind of also the purpose of these sessions, if you want to do something with Ugarit and translation alignment, and if there are any projects that you would like to integrate with it, or if you just speak a language that is not in there or is very limitedly attested, please get in touch. Write to us, talk to us if you want to see your alignment data in a particular fashion, if you want to integrate it in a paper, if you want to do a particular type of investigation, absolutely get in touch. We would be delighted to offer assistance in any way that we can. And at the end of the session on the Sunoikisis webpage, you will be able to find a couple of exercises. They're divided into tiers of difficulty. So depending on where you are, you can decide to do more analytical experiments or more computer science data extraction. So have a look at them if this is a requirement for the session or just to play around with Ugarit. And now I'm going to turn the stage to Maia for a demo and for her experience.
Thank you, Chiara. Hi all. I am Maia Shukhosvili. I am from Tbilisi State University, where I teach ancient Greek. And the important part of my work is to translate ancient Greek texts to Georgian. Today I want to talk about my experience of text alignment, my own translation alignment. I'll just share the screen. It was part of a big project which aimed translation of Plato's trilogies, the Theaetetus, Sophists, and Statesmen from ancient Greek into Georgian. These texts was not translated into Georgian, so they are first translations. In these frames, there was a part of my project to somehow to make experiment and align the translation of Theaetetus of Georgian translation to original one. The project was funded by Rustaveli National Foundation, Scientific Foundation, and 2 months I spent at Leipzig University together with Tariq Youssef, and it's my experience. First of all, I want just briefly to talk about translation methodology because it's very closely connected then to the part of text alignment. Before I started to translate these texts from ancient Greek to Georgian, I wanted to make a clear methodology, to define clear methodology and strategy of translation. Taking into consideration that Plato's dialogues are not only philosophy but literary works as well. So the strategy and methodology of my translation was that they were close to original texts, and even in some cases it does not sound nice in Georgian. It's like word-for-word translation. The source language word order in translation is preserved, and elements of semantical and literal translation are included. There is minimum change without regard to connotative or contextual meaning. The translation strategy chosen was very convenient for alignment process. I had source text was imported from Persian's repository, and for Georgian I used my own translation. The start point of alignment was to read through both the source sentence and translated sentence before aligning. First focus was on aligning all the content morphemes, and after all the content morphemes were aligned, it was possible to shift to align function morphemes. So I tried not to leave morphemes unattended. Georgian translation of Plato's text contains a few omissions and additions to source text, so the large majority of aligned pairs are one-to-one. But there are also many cases when aligned pairs are one-to-many or many-to-one or many-to-many. Here is one example, the verb onomazein. There are 3 words which define this verb in Georgian. Here is another example where we need only one word, one verb, to translate hemin epipletei. And this is also a very interesting example where then apokrisin apodunei to eromeno, this is case of many-to-one, is expressed only by one verb in Georgian. There are no articles in Georgian, so they always are paired with a noun. And the same is for particles, which very often function to underline several parts of speech or strengthen their meaning in Plato's dialogues. So they are always paired with the word they refer to. This is case of different forms of the verb to be, to eine in Greek. They are not separately used in Georgian, the specific of Georgian verb, and they are paired together with a word which comprise eine in itself. So this one example of one. In translation process, very often specific meaning of phrases need some additional words to express the exact meaning in Georgian. So there are some extensions in Georgian texts which always are in square brackets. The words in square brackets are always aligned with Greek corresponding words. This is one example of this. Here are some conclusions as just to underline. I am not a person from computer sciences or even digital humanities. I used the Ugarit alignment editor as to align and to one more check my own translation. The one-to-one word aligning approach seems to be very limited for such texts as Plato's dialogues. Alignment process is very useful and interesting from the perspective of translating theory. It gives to translator opportunity to check the translation once again. And from the perspective of translating theory, it's important to evaluate translations also. I wanted to start with also three-language translation. If I share my screen, if you can see. This is just the beginning of the text of Sophist of Plato, together with English translation and Georgian translation. But this very beginning, and I'm going to continue this work. That was all from my side that I wanted to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that we've seen a very good range of theoretical and practical discussions from the three of you. I think that's been extremely useful. Did anybody want to add anything or ask anything?
In the meantime, just a few notes. There are comments on Twitter. If you're interested in that, there is a Twitter account for Ugarit if you want to follow the activities of this project. And of course, all these things are possible thanks to the work of Tarek Youssef, who is in the chat on YouTube, who built this tool, and we are using it. So, and exactly so. Just to thank him for the work, and we have been using that tool in many different projects.
I had a very quick question while we're waiting. I mean, people can also comment and ask questions in the live chat. Please do, and we've got a few comments, but no questions yet as far as I can see. But you mentioned early on, I think, Chiara, the Ugarit was designed both for manual and for machine-assisted translation alignment. Has any of the machine-assisted alignment been implemented yet in Ugarit, or is that something that it would feed into rather than being delivered on the site itself?
It's not available to users yet, but it's something that we've been developing for quite some time now.
Right. Can you tell us a little bit about how that might work? How the work we do in Ugarit might feed into that?
Oh, so the original idea was to use basically all of the data that would be produced in Ugarit to feed an automatic translation alignment method. Originally was based on statistical methods, but now Tarek in particular has changed towards other things, other models. We used the data for some time, but then there you go. But right now we also need a system to filter through the database in order to create suitable training data sets. Because at this point, as we mentioned, a lot of different types of users use Ugarit for different reasons. And we're also designing alignment guidelines for people who instead want to, support that particular effort.
Yes, there were also various experiments in the past, for example, using name entities for aligning Greek and Latin, but also for other languages. So to find strategies also for individuating words, in this case, name entities, that can be then automatically aligned with, with an automatic alignment with different distances. So this is the thing. We need not only manual annotations, but also other strategies to get possible results. And we experimented that in the past, for example, but still, and as Tarek commented, so the work is done. But there are other questions, I think, in the chat.
Yes, so there's a few questions here now from Anisa.
Yes, I can answer that. I was actually hoping for this question to come up, and Farnoosh and Maia can definitely add something to that. Okay, so a couple of things. It has to be a nuanced answer. There seems to be a positive correlation between expertise and one-to-one, specifically in cases where the alignment is performed for particular purposes. So for teaching, for example, for pedagogy, there seems to be a particular attention to lexical equivalences rather than syntactic or morphological equivalences, and you can probably guess why. However, the particular ratio of one-to-one versus one-to-many, many-to-many, many-to-one also depends heavily on the language pair, because there are languages that have a higher potential for one-to-one translation pairs, and there are languages that have a much more diversified, a much more difficult, so to speak, proportion between the various options. And actually, we saw a couple of instances with Persian where the trends are not that linear. There is definitely a pretty high percentage of one-to-one, but the one-to-many is also very, very strongly attested, even with expert users. And so there are a lot of factors that go into that.
From my experience, I just came to add that I tried to have the majority of one-to-one pairs, but Georgian grammar is very different from European language grammars. And it has very distinct features. For example, it's split ergativity, or for example, polypersonal verb agreement systems. So it depends on language. I agree with you.
Yeah, I think I've also just been experimenting with, just this afternoon to remind myself of how Ugarit works, with aligning a very, very loose translation, actually a translation of song lyrics. So you know, they're very, very loose quite often. And for that, word by word translation, there would be sort of one word in 20 would match, and the rest would be left unmatched. So I'm trying to translate phrases because they're more idiomatic. And you know, that way where you can get some sort of size. I think in some ways I would almost expect, with given a baseline of linguistic competence, that students trying this out for the first time might naively align things one-to-one because they think that's what you're supposed to do, whereas a more expert user might do more subtle things with it. I'm not trying to cast myself as the more expert user in that scenario, but there's a question, isn't there, of what your goals are.
Yeah, it very much depends on the language pair.
Well.
What non-expert users are going to do depends on the language pair. If you have a highly inflected language or agglutinative language versus a non-inflected or slightly inflected, you may see a lot of word groups being aligned by non-expert users. But as you were saying, there is also the problem of lexical correspondence. Non-expert users are going to be a lot more tolerant with establishing one-to-one pairs.
So I think the next couple of comments by Anita on here are a second question taken together. So it's hard to think of translations without adding notes to them. But how do we then model these notes? Could an alignment editor be implemented so that it could include such notes, and how would that affect the vocabulary pairs?
So in translation alignment in general, in the development of these kinds of tools, one of the most popular things to do to address, the different nuances of partial alignment and so on, is to create different degrees of alignment. And so ideally, you would have different labels to classify different kinds of translation pairs, depending on whether the relationship between the two languages is perfectly matching, perfect match, which almost never happens, to be honest, or partial match, and which degree of partial match there may be. Notes are a little bit more difficult to model because obviously they are not, even if they are extremely standardized, they are more difficult to work with in a computational environment. So our next or future work, so to speak, is geared towards the idea of having the users add labels for different degrees of translation pairs, although that is also extremely complex at the level of database, because at that point it requires to create, it requires the ability to have filters, and it requires the ability to have a variety of control systems in place. But honestly, Anisa, thanks for the suggestion, and we will take that certainly in account, because I don't see the reason why we couldn't have user notes that are somehow integrated in the environment or in the reading environment. Just so that is definitely something that we can think about.
Well, maybe on this point, we can say that, speaking of notes, of course, we would like to have assertions. But a thing that we have been discussing a lot about translation alignment is also documenting, not in the tool, but at least in an external paper, in a document. So your decisions, because different translators can produce different alignments. We know that. So the effort is to be consistent and then to try to document this. And then maybe about notes, but we can also think of usually, or in many cases, when producing these alignments, would be also nice to produce linguistic annotations through banking these documents. And I have a question for Farnoosh, because you showed the example of this extremely interesting inscription. But do we have in that case also examples of traces of the translation in the syntax of the text? Because this is something, especially when we have these trilingual or text. So do we have traces of syntactic reuses through the languages?
I think we have an example. I think I have said, but I can't think of an example in this inscription. The problem is I haven't aligned that section. Otherwise, I would have shown it to you. So yes, and I think that would be very not in this inscription only, but that's actually a very, very common issue for English to Persian, because we have a lot of translators use passive voice in Persian when translating from English, where normally Persian wouldn't use passive, and passive verbs are not that common in Persian. There's a theory as actually that this is how the whole passive voice in Persian has come to be so common throughout translation from English and French. But I think we can trace back certain examples, both in translations from English to Persian and from this inscription as well.
Yes, of course, for inscriptions it's more difficult, but we know that we have cases of reuses at the syntactic level. And this is interesting, for example, to see which text was produced first. So in this case, you said that the first version was the Persian, and then the Greek was the translation. We know the problem for the Rosetta Stone, for example, a very famous example. So probably which was the text that was produced first, the Greek or not. So of course, with prose text, we have more opportunities. But of course, today our discussion is about translation alignment. But is speaking of the data, tree banking and linguistic annotations, of course, can be good also for expanding these translation alignments.
Yeah, it occurred to me when you were talking about notes or annotations on what kind of translation we're talking about. Is it a close translation, an exact match? It occurred to me sometimes you want to align things that aren't necessarily a match at all, because so mistranslations. So one of the students here has been thinking about looking at texts that are Bowdlerized, which is to say that they're obscene texts in the ancient language that have been made suitable for children in the English translation. And so what do you do when the Greek, a Greek word that ought to mean buggered is translated by something completely anodyne in English? You don't want to just omit them because they're not. It's not a match. You also want to say that's the word that's being mistranslated, which is not an alignment. It's sort of the opposite of an alignment,
Yeah, I mean, actually, you can use. There are applications where there exists an explicit link, an explicit alignment link that is like wrong translation or something like, or zero match, but it's actually a link. First of all, I believe that's a great idea. It's a fantastic project. But again, this is just an example of the wildly different applications that you can use this particular environment for. And I mean, it's complicated from the perspective of a database, but again, when a database has the potential to filter users, it's not even that disruptive. But I believe that there are definitely users, again, starting from non-expert users, who use lexical alignment in different ways and for very, very different purposes. This is probably just an extreme example of that.
Could you maybe suggest a couple of other tools that people might experiment with that have different functionalities? Maybe we could add them to the session page.
We can I can make a list.
Yeah, that might have, especially if they have, as you say, this sort of way of assigning what sort of a translation you're making, what sort of a match you're asserting. Yeah.
Yeah.
That'd be nice. Thank you. So there's a bit of a back channel chat going on in the live chat over there, but please feel free to carry on posting questions over there for the next couple of minutes if anyone has them.
As people write down more questions, I just want to reiterate what Monica said about the need for integration with syntactic information and morphological analysis. That's kind of in the long-term future for us, but we're definitely thinking about integrating part of speech, at the very least, part of speech taggers and hopefully syntactic analysis as well. It is difficult from the viewpoint of modeling, of course, but it would be not only nice to have, but to a certain extent it is necessary, especially in learning environments and in more sophisticated translation comparisons. Translation alignment can only take into account so much of the structural linguistic differences, and so it is absolutely necessary to think about other ways in which we can encode and model that difference. So that's absolutely important. And then, as I mentioned, we are trying to write also guidelines to help users kind of sort of try to define and document a strategy depending on what they're doing. But again, it is crucial. If you're a Ugarit user, try to document your choices, especially if you're doing this for a project or for research and things like that.
Yeah, that's important. I really like the way you've expressed the exercise for this session, the alignment exercise, as opposed to the analytic exercise, in those sort of three parts. Sort of one, do a little bit of alignment, then as you do so, you'll have to make decisions. Then document those decisions and set them as a set of rules for yourself, and then try and follow those rules for a few more lines, and see. Can you follow them to the letter now that you've made them, or do you suddenly find you have to start breaking them again when something else weird happens? And I think that's really useful, because if you just say, try and think of what the rules are going to be. This is going to be a close alignment. then when you come across exceptions, you'll just make exceptions. But if you've written down rules and you're actually breaking a written down rule, you become much more conscious of it. And I think that's a really, really useful exercise. So thank you for that. Yeah, I look forward to hearing back from my students next week how they got on with that exercise. That's very cool.
And again, adding up to that, that is not to say that everybody has to follow the same guidelines. And probably actually what will happen is that even users who try to follow the same guidelines will have a degree of disagreement between them for the reasons that we have said. Not everything can be prevented in guidelines. But again, that's just part of the deal. Translation alignment is extremely difficult. And certain choices have to do with factors, contingent factors that we cannot control, or maybe that we do not want to control.
Yes, because it is a truly philological activity. So we want different options. So, and we don't want to control that in that sense. And yes, in the chat there is a reference to Inscription, which is a tool for annotations. That's it. So Ugarit is for the alignment, and of course we can combine it with other tools for annotations, for different kinds of annotations, like linguistic annotations or semantic annotations. And next week we will talk about these tools and other tools for annotations.
Great. Well, if there are no other immediate questions, and I don't see anything else in the chat that has a question mark in it, then perhaps we should thank Chiara and Farnoosh and Maia again. Again, if we were in a classroom, we would be having a round of applause now, and we'd probably take them for a pint afterwards. But as it is, we have to make do with things. So thank you all very much, and see you soon. And yes, do join us next week for the next session, which is on text and web annotation, when Monica will be joined by Valeria Vitale from the Alan Turing Institute and talking about various different tools for annotating different kinds of information in text. So see you all then. Thanks again.